Hey there, race fans. It's Race Day Top 5 with me, Frank 5. Darlington, the lady in black, the track too tough to tame. She certainly was an animal last night in the opening race of the NASCAR Cup Series playoffs, where so many of our playoff drivers ran into some problems. Some were able to overcome those issues, some were not so fortunate, but one playoff driver that's been close so many times here finally tamed the lady in black and punched his ticket to the next round. Let's get into all that went down in the playoff opener at Darlington last night. Number 1, Kyle Larson, Young Money, finally is victorious at Darlington as he captured last night's Cookout Southern 500, beating out Tyler Reddick, Chris Buescher, William Byron, and Ross Chastain for the victory. Kyle Larson's third win of the season, and this win punches his ticket to the round of 12. This is a track that Kyle Larson's been trying to win at for quite some time in the Cup Series. Now, he finally won there in the Xfinity Series earlier this year, driving for Colleague Racing. But again, Xfinity. He's been close so many times in the Cup Series, like I can't even fathom it. I mean, he's been close since he joined Hendrick Motorsports. Although then again, his time at Ganassi, he was pretty close to winning this race. I mean, 5 years ago, he was the dominant car. Nobody had anything for him until he had a late race pit stop that put him back a little bit, and he could never get past Brad Keselowski and Joey Logano late, and he ended up finishing in the top 5, but didn't win the race. And then we had the spring race that we started running at Darlington again in 2021, where he finished runner-up to Martin Truex Jr. We come back there in the summertime in the opener of the playoff race, and he wall rode through 3 and 4, trying to catch the 11 of Denny Hamlin to try to pass him. It didn't work out, but he ended up getting second place in that race. And, you know, the last year or so, he's been kind of close at times at Darlington, finishing runner-up just, again, a few times. And then earlier this year, he was in prime position, more likely to win the race on Throwback Weekend on Mother's Day. But on the restart, him and Ross Chastain were side by side in one, and they made contact, both of them into the wall, and knocked them both out in contention. Larson was not happy with Ross Chastain for that. But this time, start off the playoffs, Larson had to come all the way from 18th on the grid, which, you know, didn't qualify well, but I guaranteed he wouldn't be there for long because this track kind of plays into his driving style as a dirt racer because the track's so worn out, you can slip and slide and move around anywhere you want. Ride the wall, the middle of the racetrack, but Larson likes to run the wall basically as long as you're not scraping it. But he charged his way from 18th all the way up towards the top 5 by the end of stage 1 and was relatively in there the majority of the night. He was perhaps the third best car right behind the 2 Toyotas of Denny Hamlin and Tyler Reddick. Larson was just on his game, staying up there for the most part, got a little more track position as the race went on, but then he had a moment in the middle of the race where the car went into neutral and he hit the wall and the car all of a sudden got tight and he lost some spots and it felt like, oh no, he's in trouble. But then they were able to come in when they had a caution to work on the car, get those new tires on, and the car pretty much drove better than after it hit the wall where he got neutral at one point. And he had to sort of have a couple of restarts late in the final stage when he was the control car. But despite the challenges from behind, Larson was able to hold them off and get that Darlington win that he's been waiting for. And he finally adds another crown jewel to his Cup career. He won the Coke 600, remember, back in 2021, his first year with Hendrick, and now he has a Southern 500 to add to his racing resume. A very impressive job. And this is a good thing for Kyle Larson to win this race, not just to advance him into the next round, but to get some momentum on their side. Most of the races that I've been watching Kyle Larson this year, if he's winning, he's winning. But if he's not winning, he's more likely in the garage after he wrecked the race car, because there have been races this year where Larson's had some good race cars, but most times he ends up getting wrecked by himself or by somebody else out there. It's kind of been the story of the season. But I had faith entering these playoffs that can Kyle Larson put that stuff aside and he can maybe open the round with a win at this track that suits his driving style. There's no doubt in my mind he can go far in these playoffs. And now that he's locked into the round of 12, he gets a few more bonus points and some momentum on his side. And now he can just run the next 2 races with no pressure whatsoever and just have fun. And he can play spoiler to the other 15 drivers that are trying to win one of these next 2 races and gain more bonus points before we get started for the round of 12. But a great job by Kyle Larson and Cliff Daniels and the 5 team all of last night. They are officially locked into the round of 12. Number 2, Tyler Reddick, runner-up after running top 5 all night long. Tyler Reddick was one of the other drivers that I felt confident heading into this race because this track, like Larson, suits his driving style as a dirt racer. And he was in the top 5 pretty much the entire night, like the 5 car was when he got his track position. Reddick was pretty much second fiddle to Denny Hamlin for the majority of the night, but then Reddick got his track position when he was able to take the lead in the beginning of the final stage when everybody was in the middle of green flag pit stops. And he had a couple of challenges from a few drivers like Kevin Harvick and, of course, Kyle Larson, but it seemed like nobody could add anything for Reddick. But when we had that caution come out for Ryan Newman, who spun right behind Reddick, literally almost got into him when that happened, everybody came down pit road, and Kyle Larson was able to beat the 45 car off of pit road as well as everyone else. And Reddick was giving it everything he had those final laps, even with the cautions that we had mixed in. He tried everything possible, but there were times where he was as loose as the 5 car was, and while trying to run him down, grazed the wall a couple of times and kept bringing the guys behind him and Buescher and Byron closer, pretty much hurting his chances of momentum and any shot possible to run down Kyle Larson. But I was very impressed with Tyler Reddick last night, not just himself, but the pit crew. I came into these playoffs the last couple of weeks, I've been hard on the 45 team because of the pit mistakes. I felt like if these mistakes come to haunt them in the playoffs again in this opening round, there's no chance he gets into the round of 12 if they have those mistakes. There was not a single mistake on that 45 team last night when it came to pit stops. They were rock solid all night long. They put together a superb performance in the pits. Yes, they didn't win the race, but when you look at the points at the end of the night, you have a 35-point cushion after your performance last night, heading into Kansas next week in a track where you've also been good at in the past. If you can keep that performance from last night up and carry it into these final 2 races, Tyler Reddick will be in the round of 12. And if he can maybe carry that momentum and maybe turn into a win next weekend, it would also be something special. But Reddick did a phenomenal job last night, and the pit crew stayed together the entire race and put together some solid stops and got them that result, and that's what has him 30-plus points above the cutoff heading into next weekend's race of Kansas. So good job by that 45 team last night. Number 3, Hamlin dominates, but has a late pit stop issue taking him out of contention. All of last night, Denny Hamlin, a track where he has just been so good, pretty much the same resume as drivers like David Pearson, Richard Petty, Dale Earnhardt, Jeff Gordon, Darrell Waltrip, and others at this track. Denny Hamlin's at the top of the leaderboard when it comes to success at Darlington. And he showcased that last night, trying to sweep the weekend after he won the Xfinity race on Saturday. Hamlin had the best car at the start of the race. When he took the lead after the first round of green flag pit stops, he had the lead and seemed to be in control despite some challenges from behind by Reddick and Kyle Larson. But he held on to win stage 1, and stage 2, he was once again untouchable despite, Larson and Reddick keeping within taps of him about 2.5 to 3 seconds. Hamlin was so strong, especially out front in the clean air, and the momentum seemed to be on his side to get another win at Darlington. But at the start of the final stage, when everybody was going through green flag pit stops, Hamlin's team completed their stop and he left pit road. But Hamlin came back a few laps later because he said, I got a vibration, it might be a loose wheel. And he came in, and that ultimately took Denny Hamlin out of contention for the victory because he fell a lap down, and despite a couple of cautions where he was battling for the free pass, he never got his lap back and was part of a late race wreck. Now, believe it or not, when the crew checked the tire, they didn't see whether the lug was possibly loose on the car. And obviously, Chris Gabehart asked Hamlin on the radio, if it's loose, are you sure it's loose? And Hamlin, the driver, he behind the wheel, he knows what it feels like to possibly have a loose wheel vibration. He basically went off of instinct to figure, I may need to pit because I've got a loose wheel, and I don't want to jeopardize wrecking the car and hurting ourselves when it comes to the points, despite those stage wins that he accumulated early in the race. So he had no choice. He came to pit road. It ultimately took him out of contention, and ultimately, unfortunately, he never recovered and ended up finishing 25th, 1 lap down. Now, points-wise, despite all that, he's still 20-plus points above the cutoff line, so he's good for the next 2 races, I'm pretty sure, as long as he doesn't have a collapse. But you think about what could have been. They had the best car last night. If you do not have that loose wheel, we're not talking about Kyle Larson winning the race last night. We're talking about Denny Hamlin sweeping the weekend. But unfortunately, he pitted because he felt like the wheel was loose, and ultimately took him out of contention to win another Southern 500. That's the sad part about what happened to Denny Hamlin last night. But just a couple hours ago, as I'm filming this video, Hamlin announced that he is not going anywhere. He is staying with Joe Gibbs Racing as he signed a multi-year contract extension with the team. Obviously, multi-year contract extensions, we don't know the terms. It basically doesn't mean anything. It means multi-years, 2 to 3 to maybe 4 years, depending on the longevity of it all. But Hamlin will be with Joe Gibbs Racing for the foreseeable future. But the question is obviously, is FedEx going to be back with him next year? That will be a question that will be answered down the road. But all we know is that Hamlin is still with the team, and they can now focus on the championship and not these contract talks. So Hamlin's locked up for Joe Gibbs Racing for a few more years, but ultimately last night, that mistake took him out of contention to win another Southern 500. Number 4, playoff attrition. There was so much attrition that our playoff contenders faced last night. A lot of the big names of the sport and some of the underdogs. I mean, it just seems like ever since we introduced Darlington as the opening race of the playoffs in 2020, almost half, if not more, of the playoff drivers on our grid run into some type of problem. A crash, a pit mistake, an engine failure, anything. It always seems to happen ever since we introduced Darlington as the opening playoff race. And that's the excitement and the drama that builds for these playoffs. Starting off with the pole sitter, Christopher Bell, who led the field of green last night, and he seemed to be untouchable when he was out front. But then we have our first pit stop of the race on the green flag pit stops. He comes in, the crew jack up the right side, and the car fell off the jack because the jackman maybe didn't get the jack far enough under the car, or didn't twist it hard enough to jack it up high enough so they could change the tire. So they had to do it again. They finally changed tires, and Christopher Bell took off. Remember, he swapped his original pit crew from earlier this year with Ty Gibbs' pit crew because Gibbs has the third fastest pit crew this season. So they decided to do that to help Bell because Bell's team this year on pit road has not been that good whatsoever. And I'm not talking about the crew chief. I'm talking about the guys going over the wall. But after that first pit stop, Bell and the team had a better pit stop the second go-round, and he was starting to reel back in those guys after he lost that track position. But then he faded at the end of stage 1, and literally at the end of the first stage, he hit the wall coming off turn 2, and the car was never the same after that. He was stuck in the middle of the pack, had a tight car the rest of the race. They felt like the toe was knocked out. They tried working on the car as best they could. They fell a lap down, but they got their lap back on a wave round late in the end of stage 2. And then he tried to fight his way back into the top 15 late, but was part of some late race incidents later in the race. And ultimately, Christopher Bell finished the first car lap down in 23rd spot. Not a great run for a guy that really, again, needs to clean up the pit road mistakes like the 45 team, even with his new pit crew. But they were a team that at the beginning last night looked like they were going to be the ones to beat. And then after that contact with the wall and that pit stop, the first one of the night, nothing went their way the rest of the race. Then we go to his teammate, Martin Truex Jr., a guy that I thought was going to be a front runner at the end of the race with Denny Hamlin and Kyle Larson and Tyler Reddick, because Truex has always been good here. He's a former winner of the Southern 500 for crying out loud. Well, last night, they didn't start the race off well because they didn't qualify well. They started 31st. They slowly worked their way through the field despite just being stuck in the top 25 for the majority of the first part of the race. Then they got to the top 15 by the start of stage 2, and I'm like, okay, here we go. Truex is on his way to the front. But then after the first round of green flag pit stops at the start of the second stage, Martin Truex Jr. came back to pit road because he felt he had a loose wheel. And it turns out he did. He ended up losing 2 laps in the process. Then he got his lap back by passing the leader, stayed a lap down for a while, and then, like most of the cars at the end of stage 2 and the later laps, he took the wave around and was able to get his lap back. But he really never recovered from that loose wheel incident and was not happy with the car. He said it was the loosest he's ever been at Darlington. That's really something. And as old as the track is, you're slipping and sliding, I'm not surprised. And all they could muster last night was an 18th place finish. Not the best performance. But thanks to the bonus points he accumulated in the regular season with the wins and the stage wins and the regular season championship that he secured last weekend at Daytona, he's just 26 points above the cutoff line. I think Truex will be safe through this first round. If he can have a solid top 5, top 10 run next weekend in Kansas, you don't have to worry about Bristol whatsoever. But unfortunately, a guy that I thought was going to be a factor last night had issues a little early in the race and never really became a factor at all. Then we go to Kevin Harvick, who's made his final start at Darlington in his final Southern 500 appearance. He was in the top 5, top 10 all of last night, the best of the Ford camp at times, but mostly he was the best Ford driver in the majority of the race. He was staying in touch with those guys as well for the majority of the race. And then at the start of the final stage, when Denny Hamlin was out of contention after the loose wheel pit stop, Harvick found himself into second place. I'm like, here comes the closer. He's going to be nipping at Tyler Reddick, and it looked like he was going to have something for him, and we could have been talking about Kevin Harvick winning his third Southern 500 because he won it in 2014 when it was a spring race at the time, and of course, it was the first race at the playoffs that we introduced in 2020 when he beat Austin Dillon. He was coming. It looked like he had something for Tyler Reddick. But when he was coming down to pit road, that caution I mentioned earlier about Ryan Newman spinning right behind the leader Tyler Reddick, well, Kevin Harvick was coming to pit road. The caution lights came on just a few seconds before he crossed the pit entry line, and therefore he committed to pit road at the time, and that means when you come to pit road and the lights are already on before you cross the pit entry line, you are therefore forced to go to the tail end of the longest line for pitting too early. And unfortunately, that took Kevin Harvick out of the race for the win because he never got his track position back. All he could get was a 19th place finish last night. Not what I expected out of him. I mean, obviously, the car and the speed was there. It's just the timing of that caution and the lights to the pit road entry coming out just a few seconds before he crossed the line. If he'd gotten past that line and then the lights come on right after that, he would have been fine with his pit stop and he would have had good track position. But unfortunately, the lights coming on right before he crossed the line really hurt his race, and it's a shame because, again, I thought Harvick had something for those guys and those Toyotas and those Chevrolets at the end of that race. And then we go to the man who won at an Indianapolis road course race a few weeks ago, Michael McDowell. He had a rough night. The car was absolutely tight, did not handle at all whatsoever, despite qualifying in the top 10 and having good pace in practice. But then again, it was during the daytime when we had that, and that doesn't necessarily mean anything come racing under the lights. And McDowell struggled a lot of the night. He got his lap back eventually through wave rounds, but after that he still struggled for the most part and was part of the last caution of the race on a wreck on the front stretch that he ran into the back of the 11 car, Denny Hamlin, and killed the 34 car, sending him to the garage and ultimately out of the race at 19 below the cutoff line. Again, Michael McDowell, the story of him getting into the playoffs and winning an Indy road course was great. But most of us had him getting eliminated in the first round because as good as their performance has been in recent years in that 34 team, I didn't think it would be strong enough in this first round, especially with the limited playoff points that you have to your availability. Even with the win and the stage win at Indianapolis, it really, I think, has hurt them, and now they're going to be in must-win the next two races, and I don't think it's possible. But a lot of the playoff drivers dealt with a lot of attrition last night. Some were able to bounce back from early attrition and get good results, but guys like Bell, Truex, Harvick, and McDowell had a rough go at it last night like the 11 car did. And number 5, Bowman versus Suarez Part 2. Last night, late in the race, we had an incident where Alex Bowman and Daniel Suarez were racing for position on the front stretch, and they were two guys that early in the race, I wouldn't have even given you a nickel to see them in the top 10 late in the race because they were out to lunch. They were not happy with their cars at the start of the race. They both each fell a lap down at one point, then both of them got their laps back, and then through the magic of track position and adjustments, they found themselves inside the top 10 and looked to be on their way to solid top 10 runs for two guys that came short of making the playoffs last week by needing to win at Daytona and not getting the job done. But last night, with about, I'd say, 60 laps to go, 65 laps to go, they were racing each other hard at the front stretch, and Bowman was blocking the 99 of Daniel Suarez, and then coming back up the track, Bowman comes out in front just when the 99 hits the rear bumper of the 48, and then hooked the 48 into the outside wall and collected Suarez, and then Suarez comes back in the track and gets hit in the driver's side door by Harrison Burton, and that sucked because Burton was having a really good run at the end of that race, just like he was in the spring race, but both Bowman and Suarez were not happy with each other, let's say. Suarez called Bowman an idiot for the blocking that he was doing on the front stretch all the way to turn one. Now, obviously, Bowman has the right to block, but I think that the blocks were a little too aggressive. Bowman, said, I feel bad about the whole team and I feel bad for the 99, but he kind of drives over his head as well. I mean, both as relatively young drivers, you do have that type of driving habits for the most part, driving a little over your heads, and they make contact and ultimately both under the wall and both not happy with each other despite all that. I mean, are we going to see part 3 continuing going forward? Because remember, these guys had a problem earlier this year at the end of the COTA race, and it led to Suarez bumping the 48 car when they were at reduced speed coming down pit road after the checkered flag was already thrown. So NASCAR is going to probably need to keep their eye on these guys the next few races. I don't think we're going to have retaliation. The only tracks I could see are Bristol, the Roval, and of course Martinsville. But they got to be careful with this because somebody could get hurt, and we don't need this to continue and have it affect any playoff drivers around. Because if you remember the Kyle Larson, Bubba Wallace incident last year, Bubba retaliated on Larson for an incident that Larson just got loose in the inside of him, and Bubba came down the track and just flat turned him into the 20 of Christopher Bell, who was a playoff driver at the time. I know he won a few weekends later in Martinsville and got him the championship for, but still, we don't need somebody to retaliate against somebody and have a playoff driver possibly be affected by something that they didn't deserve to be a part of whatsoever. So Bowman and Suarez got to keep cool heads. Obviously, both frustrated with each other. It's a heat of the moment, but that was a little crazy last night between those two at the very end of the race. It was a crazy race in general. I feel like, again, Darlington as a playoff race as the opener, I like it. It's fun. It's entertaining. It brings drama to the first race of the playoffs. And a lot of the playoff drivers that dealt with the attrition last night, some were able to overcome that and get good results. Others not so fortunate. It's crazy. I mean, it was like absolutely wild. But one other thing about last night, the lights, and I'm talking about like when the lights come on, it gets a little intense. The lights in the infield in turns 3 and 4 towards the latter part of stage 2 went out, and we had to throw a caution so they could go down there and work on the generators powering those lights and fix it. After a brief red flag, we fixed it, and we continue on the rest of the night with no issues whatsoever. But that was a little bit odd, because when I was watching the first couple laps of the second stage, I'm like, does turns 3 and 4 look a little dark to me? Like, is it the outside lights? But then I realized, oh, right, there's lights on the inside of the track because they needed to see where they're going coming to pit road with the pit entry line. But that was a little crazy. But all in all, it was a very fun, entertaining race last night. A good race on Labor Day weekend, a tradition that, for many, many years, Darlington has been the host of Labor Day weekend racing. We stopped that tradition after 2003. Then we brought it back in 2015, including Throwback Weekend and Labor Day weekend. This weekend was a perfect time, obviously, to watch some racing, kick back with your friends, and have a nice grill out and barbecue and drink a couple cold beers and maybe a couple of margaritas as well in honor of the late, great Jimmy Buffett, who passed away this weekend. And I miss him. I love his music. I still love his music. And he was the one that inspired me to pick up a guitar in the first place, as you could tell by my Fender shirt. Rest in peace, Jimmy. You're wasting away in Margaritaville right now. I know it. Rest in peace, legend. But anyways, fun racing at Darlington this weekend. Now we're on to race 2, and we're headed off to Kansas City, baby, while the Chiefs open up their home opener of the season in the first game of the NFL season this Thursday night. A couple days after that, we've got NASCAR action in Kansas City. Last year, Bubba Wallace played spoiler as a non-playoff driver and took the victory from playoff drivers. Will the playoff drivers be able to get the victory this time around, whether it's Larson, who's already locked in, or Martin Truex, or Denny Hamlin, or Christopher Bell overcoming last night's mistakes? We will see. Some will benefit and run well, and some will run into more issues. It'll be a very entertaining race, and I can't wait. So I hope you all have a wonderful week. I hope you have a great rest of your Labor Day. Have a great weekend. Enjoy all the NFL action and college football action this weekend. Good luck to your teams on opening night and opening day. Subscribe, like, and congrats once again to Kyle Larson and the 5 team on their win at Darlington last night. Have a great week, everybody. Let's go racing.